Matthew Turner stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Hamptons mansion, gazing out at the meticulously manicured lawns that stretched as far as the eye could see. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, a beautiful sight that would have taken most people's breath away. But for Matthew, it was just another day ending in his gilded cage. At 42 years old, Matthew had achieved what most would consider the pinnacle of success. He was a self-made billionaire, the founder and CEO of Turner Enterprises, a global conglomerate that had its fingers in everything from tech to real estate. His name was synonymous with wealth and power, his face gracing the covers of business magazines and his words quoted by aspiring entrepreneurs worldwide. Yet, as he stood there in his tailored Armani suit, a glass of 18-year-old scotch in hand, Matthew felt a familiar emptiness gnawing at his insides. The mansion around him, with its marble floors, priceless artworks, and rooms he'd never even stepped foot in, felt more like a mausoleum than a home. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional footsteps of staff members scurrying about their duties, careful to stay out of his way. Matthew took a sip of his scotch, savoring the burn as it slid down his throat. He turned away from the window, his eyes falling on a framed photo on his desk. It was of his two children, Max and Sophie, aged 10 and 8, respectively. The photo had been taken at their school's recent sports day, an event Matthew had promised to attend but ultimately missed due to an urgent business meeting. A pang of guilt shot through him as he looked at their smiling faces. When was the last time he'd seen those smiles in person? When was the last time he'd had a real conversation with them that didn't revolve around their academic achievements or extracurricular activities? Matthew's relationship with his children was, at best, distant. At worst, it was non-existent. He provided for them, of course. They wanted for nothing material. The best schools, the best clothes, the best opportunities money could buy. But love, attention, a father's guidance? These were commodities Matthew Turner, for all his wealth, seemed incapable of providing. As if summoned by his thoughts, a soft knock on the door broke the silence. "Come in," Matthew called out, his voice gruff from lack of use. The door opened, and in walked Emma, the children's nanny. At 32, Emma was a beacon of warmth in the cold, sterile environment of the Turner mansion. Her soft brown eyes and gentle smile seemed to bring light wherever she went. She was dressed simply in jeans and a light sweater, her chestnut hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. "Mr. Turner," she said, her voice carrying a hint of apprehension. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but I wanted to let you know that Max and Sophie have finished their dinner. They were hoping, well, they were wondering if you might join them for dessert." Matthew felt a familiar mix of emotions wash over him. Guilt, for not having thought to join them for dinner in the first place. Irritation, at being made to feel guilty. And beneath it all, a deep, aching sadness that he quickly suppressed. "I'm afraid I can't, Emma," he replied, turning back to the window. "I have a conference call with our Asian markets in 20 minutes. Please tell them I'm sorry." He didn't need to look at Emma to know the expression on her face. Disappointment, tinged with a hint of judgment that she tried and failed to hide. "Of course, Mr. Turner. I'll let them know." As Emma turned to leave, Matthew found himself speaking again. "How are they, Emma? The children, I mean." Emma paused, her hand on the doorknob. When she spoke, her voice was soft but clear. "They're wonderful children, Mr. Turner. Max is excelling in his science classes. He's talking about wanting to be an astronaut. And Sophie, she's so creative. She's been writing these beautiful little stories. They're both doing so well, considering—" She trailed off, but the unspoken words hung in the air between them. Considering their mother's absence, considering their father's emotional distance, considering the loneliness that permeated their young lives, despite all the privilege that surrounded them. Matthew nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "Thank you, Emma. That will be all." As the door closed behind her, Matthew let out a long, shaky breath. He looked down at his watch, a limited edition Patek Philippe that cost more than most people made in a year. 15 minutes until his conference call. 15 minutes in which he could go downstairs, see his children, maybe even share a slice of whatever dessert the chef had prepared. But he didn't move. Instead, he walked over to his desk, sat down in his ergonomic chair, and began reviewing the notes for his call. Business was what he knew. Business was safe. Business didn't require him to confront the emotional wasteland his personal life had become. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room, Matthew Turner, billionaire extraordinaire, sat alone in his tower of wealth, more imprisoned than free, more pauper than prince in all the ways that truly mattered. The following weeks passed in a blur of meetings, conference calls, and business trips. Matthew threw himself into his work with renewed vigor, as if by sheer force of will he could drown out the nagging voice in his head that whispered of his failings as a father, as a human being. It was on a rainy Tuesday morning that the carefully constructed facade of Matthew Turner's life began to crumble. He was in his home office, preparing for a board meeting, when his personal assistant, a young man named Alex, burst into the room without knocking. "Mr. Turner," Alex gasped, his face pale and his eyes wide with panic. "You need to see this." He thrust a tablet into Matthew's hands. On the screen was a news article from one of the country's leading gossip sites. The headline made Matthew's blood run cold. "Billionaire's baby scandal. Turner Enterprises CEO knocks up Nanny." For a moment, Matthew couldn't breathe. The words on the screen seemed to blur and dance before his eyes. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a mistake, a cruel joke, anything but the truth. But as he forced himself to read the article, the memories came flooding back. That night, several weeks ago, the loneliness, the vulnerability, the moment of weakness. Emma, with her kind eyes and gentle touch, offering comfort in a way he hadn't experienced in years. The line they'd crossed, the unspoken agreement to never speak of it again. Except someone had spoken. Someone had told. How did they find out? Matthew managed to choke out, his voice barely above a whisper. Alex shifted uncomfortably. "We're not sure, sir, but the article mentions a former employee as their source. We're trying to track down who it might be, but—" Matthew waved him off. It didn't matter who had leaked the story. The damage was done. Even as they spoke, the news was spreading like wildfire across social media platforms and news outlets. His phone was already buzzing incessantly with calls and messages. "Get me Emma," Matthew said, his voice regaining some of its usual authority. "And call an emergency board meeting. We need to get ahead of this." As Alex scurried out of the room, Matthew sank back into his chair, his mind reeling. How could he have been so careless? He'd built his empire on calculated risks and meticulous planning. But this was a disaster he hadn't seen coming. The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of crisis management. Emma, when she finally answered his call, was in tears. She'd already been hounded by reporters outside her family's home, where she'd fled when the news broke. She confirmed what Matthew already knew. She was indeed pregnant, and yes, he was the father. The board meeting was a nightmare. Matthew sat at the head of the table, feeling the weight of disapproving stares from the men and women he'd always seen as his peers. Now, they looked at him like he was a liability, a scandal waiting to happen. "This is unacceptable, Turner," barked Gerald Hoffman, one of the senior board members. "Do you have any idea how this makes the company look? Our stock is already taking a hit." Matthew opened his mouth to respond, but was cut off by another board member, Sarah Chen. "It's not just about the stock," she said, her voice cold. "It's about integrity, trust, values, all the things we claim to stand for as a company. How are we supposed to face our shareholders, our clients, when our own CEO can't keep it in his pants?" The meeting dragged on for hours. Plans were made for damage control, press releases drafted and redrafted. Matthew sat through it all, feeling more and more like a spectator in his own life. When had he become this person? This cliché of a powerful man brought low by his own hubris? As he finally left the office late that night, he was accosted by a swarm of paparazzi outside the building. Camera flashes blinded him as he pushed through the crowd, ignoring the shouted questions and accusations. "Mr. Turner, is it true you got your nanny pregnant?" How long has the affair been going on? What do your children think about their new sibling? Matthew's driver managed to bundle him into the waiting car, slamming the door on the cacophony outside. As they pulled away, Matthew closed his eyes, feeling a migraine building behind his temples. His phone buzzed again. It was a text from his brother, Daniel. They hadn't spoken in years, not since their falling out over their parents' estate. The message was brief, but it cut Matthew to the core. Mom and Dad would be so disappointed in you. Matthew turned off his phone and leaned his head against the cool glass of the car window. Outside, the city lights blurred as they sped through the streets. He thought about his children, probably already asleep in their beds. What would he tell them? How could he explain this mess he'd created? For the first time in as long as he could remember, Matthew Turner, the man who always had a plan, who always knew what to do, felt completely and utterly lost. The days that followed the breaking of the scandal were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and sleepless nights for Matthew. His carefully cultivated image as a stern but respectable business titan was in tatters. Late-night comedians made him the butt of their jokes. Social media was awash with memes mocking his fall from grace, and even his most loyal employees eyed him with a mixture of disappointment and barely concealed judgment. It was on one such sleepless night, nearly a week after the news broke, that Matthew found himself wandering the halls of his mansion. The house seemed larger, emptier than ever before. His footsteps echoed off the marble floors, each step a reminder of the hollow life he'd built for himself. Without really meaning to, he found himself in a rarely used sitting room. Moonlight filtered through the large windows, casting long shadows across the expensive furniture. Matthew's eyes were drawn to a bookshelf in the corner, where a small silver frame caught the moonlight. He approached it slowly, as if in a trance. Picking up the frame, he felt a jolt of recognition. It was an old family photo, taken nearly 20 years ago. In it, a younger Matthew stood with his parents and his brother Daniel. They were at a lakeside cabin, all smiles and laughter. Matthew remembered that day vividly. It was the last vacation they'd all taken together before he'd thrown himself completely into building his business empire. Looking at the photo now, Matthew barely recognized himself. The young man in the picture had a light in his eyes, a joy that seemed alien to the person he'd become. His parents looked so proud, his father's arm around his shoulders, his mother beaming at the camera. And Daniel. His little brother was grinning widely, giving Matthew bunny ears behind his head. A lump formed in Matthew's throat as he stared at the image of a family long lost. When had he last spoken to Daniel, outside of terse emails about business matters? When had he last thought about his parents with anything other than a vague sense of having fulfilled their expectations of success? As he stood there, bathed in moonlight and memories, Matthew felt something inside him crack. The walls he'd built around his heart, the emotional fortifications that had allowed him to climb to the top of the business world, began to crumble. For the first time in years, Matthew Turner wept. He sank to the floor, the family photo clutched to his chest, and let out all the pent-up emotions he'd been suppressing for so long. The loneliness, the guilt, the fear. It all came pouring out in great, heaving sobs that echoed through the empty house. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, Matthew's tears finally subsided. He felt drained, but also lighter somehow, as if the act of finally confronting his emotions had lifted a great weight from his shoulders. Wiping his eyes, Matthew looked down at the photo once more. His gaze lingered on his brother's face, and suddenly he knew what he had to do. With shaking hands, he pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Matthew was about to hang up when a groggy voice answered. "Hello? Daniel?" Matthew's voice cracked. It's Matt. I'm sorry for calling so early. I needed to talk to you." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Daniel spoke again, his voice was guarded. "Matt, what's going on? Is this about the scandal? Because if you're calling for some kind of PR move—" "No," Matthew interrupted. "No, it's not about that. Well, not directly. I saw our old family photo from the lake house. Do you remember that trip?" Another pause, shorter this time. Yeah, I remember. Dad caught that huge trout, and Mom made us take about 1 million photos. Despite everything, Matthew felt a small smile tug at his lips. Yeah, that's the one. Daniel, I messed up. Not just with this scandal, but with everything, with us, with the family. I don't know when I became this person, but I don't like him very much. The words came tumbling out now, years of unspoken feelings and regrets pouring forth. I'm sorry, Danny, for everything, for pushing you away, for the fight over Mom and Dad's estate, for being so caught up in my own success that I forgot what really matters. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed you to know that I'm sorry. The silence that followed seemed to stretch on for an eternity. Matthew held his breath, half expecting to hear the click of Daniel hanging up. But then his brother's voice came through, softer this time. Oh, Matty. What happened to us? The use of his childhood nickname broke something in Matthew. Fresh tears sprang to his eyes as Daniel continued. Look, I'm not going to pretend the last few years didn't happen. You hurt me, Matt. You hurt all of us. But you're still my brother. And hearing you like this, I think maybe it's time we talked. Really talked. Matthew nodded, forgetting for a moment that Daniel couldn't see him. I'd like that, he managed to choke out. They spoke for another hour as the sun rose, beginning the long, difficult process of rebuilding their relationship. As they finally said their goodbyes, with plans to meet in person soon, Matthew felt a glimmer of something he hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope. He stood up, his joints creaking in protest after hours on the hard floor. As he placed the family photo back on the shelf, Matthew caught sight of his reflection in the window. The man looking back at him was tired, his eyes red-rimmed from crying, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled. But there was something else there, too. A spark in his eyes that hadn't been there before. The beginnings of a path forward, a chance at redemption. Matthew Turner had a long way to go, but for the first time in years, he felt ready to take that first step. Not as a billionaire CEO, not as a titan of industry, but as a man, a brother, a father. It was time to rebuild not his empire, but his life. As the first rays of sunlight streamed through the windows, painting the room in a warm, golden glow, Matthew took a deep breath. The air felt different somehow, as if the very atmosphere of the house had changed with his newfound resolve. He straightened his rumpled shirt, ran a hand through his disheveled hair, and made a decision. It was time to face the music, to confront the mess he'd made head-on. But this time, he wouldn't be doing it as the cold, calculating businessman he'd become. No. This time, Matthew Turner would face his problems as a human being, flawed, vulnerable, but determined to make things right. His first order of business was clear. He needed to talk to Emma. Not through lawyers or intermediaries, but face-to-face, human to human. With trembling hands, he picked up his phone and dialed her number. It rang several times before she answered, her voice small and hesitant. Mr. Turner? The formality in her tone made Matthew wince. How had he let things get to this point? Emma, he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. I think we need to talk. Not as employer and employee, but as two people who found themselves in a complicated situation. Can we meet? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Matthew held his breath, half expecting her to hang up. But then, barely above a whisper, came her reply. Okay, where? They agreed to meet at a small, out-of-the-way cafe in a quiet part of town. As Matthew made his way there, he felt a mix of anxiety and determination churning in his stomach. He'd faced hostile takeovers and cutthroat negotiations, but somehow, this felt more daunting than any boardroom battle. The cafe was nearly empty when he arrived. Emma was already there, sitting at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug. She looked up as Matthew approached, and he was struck by how tired she looked. The usual warmth in her eyes was dimmed, replaced by a wary caution that made his heart ache. Emma, he said softly as he sat down across from her. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me." She nodded, her gaze fixed on her mug. "What did you want to talk about, Mr. Turner?" Matthew took a deep breath. "First, please, call me Matthew. And second, I wanted to apologize. Not just for the situation we found ourselves in, but for how I've handled it. For how I've treated you, not just recently, but ever since you started working for me. You deserved better." Emma looked up, surprise flickering across her face. This wasn't the Matthew Turner she knew, the stern, distant employer who rarely showed any emotion beyond mild irritation or cold satisfaction. "I've made a mess of things," Matthew continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been so focused on building my empire that I forgot about the things that really matter. My family, my children, and the people who've stood by me like you." He reached across the table, hesitating for a moment before gently placing his hand over hers. "I can't change what happened between us, Emma, but I want you to know that I'm here. Whatever you decide to do, whatever you need, I'll support you. Not just financially, but emotionally too. If you'll let me." Emma's eyes welled up with tears, and for a moment, Matthew feared he'd said the wrong thing. But then she spoke, her voice quavering but clear. "I never wanted this, Matthew. I never wanted to be the other woman or the scandal that brought down a powerful man. I cared about you, about your children. I saw how lonely you all were, how much love was missing from that big empty house. And for a moment that night, I thought maybe—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "But that doesn't matter now. What matters is this child, our child. I won't let them grow up feeling unwanted or unloved, no matter what the world might say about how they came to be." Matthew felt a lump form in his throat. "Neither will I," he said firmly. "Emma, I know I have no right to ask this of you, but I want to be there. For you, for the baby. Not just as a distant figure writing checks, but as a father. A real father, in a way I haven't been for Max and Sophie. I know it won't be easy, and I know I have a lot to prove. But if you'll give me a chance—" Emma studied his face for a long moment, as if searching for something. Whatever she saw there must have convinced her, because she gave a small nod. "Okay," she said softly. "We can try. But Matthew, you have to understand. This isn't just about you and me. There are your other children to think about, your ex-wife, your company. This won't be easy." Matthew nodded, a determined glint in his eye. "I know. But for the first time in a long time, I'm ready to face the hard stuff. No more hiding behind my money or my power. It's time I learned to be a real human being again." As they continued to talk, making tentative plans and addressing the mountain of issues before them, Matthew felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose that went beyond profit margins and stock prices. He was embarking on the most challenging journey of his life, the journey to reclaim his humanity, to become the man, the father, the human being he should have been all along. The road ahead would be long and fraught with obstacles, but as he sat there with Emma, planning for a future neither of them had ever anticipated, Matthew Turner felt ready to face whatever came his way. Not as a billionaire, not as a CEO, but as a man trying to make things right. Little did he know, this was just the beginning of a transformation that would shake the very foundations of his world. In the weeks that followed Matthew's heartfelt conversation with Emma, the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how the scandal would unfold. The initial shock and outrage had given way to a morbid fascination, with tabloids and social media users alike speculating wildly about the future of Turner Enterprises and its disgraced CEO. Matthew, for his part, retreated from the public eye. He threw himself into the monumental task of restructuring his life, starting with his relationship with his children. Max and Sophie, initially confused and hurt by the media frenzy surrounding their father, slowly began to open up as Matthew made a concerted effort to be present in their lives. One particularly memorable afternoon found Matthew sitting cross-legged on the floor of Sophie's room, surrounded by stuffed animals and half-finished drawings. His daughter, her dark curls bouncing as she moved, was explaining the intricate storyline she'd created for her toys. "And then Mr. Whiskers, he's the brave knight, you see," Sophie said, holding up a well-worn teddy bear. "He has to save Princess Fluffy from the mean dragon." Matthew listened intently, marveling at his daughter's creativity. How many of these stories had he missed over the years? How many precious moments had slipped by while he was busy chasing the next big deal? "That's amazing, sweetheart," he said, genuine wonder in his voice. "What happens next?" Sophie beamed at him, clearly thrilled by his interest. As she launched into the next part of her tale, Matthew felt a warmth spread through his chest. This, he realized, was what truly mattered. Not the numbers in his bank account or the size of his company, but these small, perfect moments with his children. Meanwhile, Max was proving to be a tougher nut to crack. The 10-year-old had retreated into a shell of sullen silence in the wake of the scandal, barely speaking to Matthew beyond monosyllabic responses. It wasn't until Matthew stumbled upon Max poring over a book about space that he found a way in. "You know," Matthew said casually, leaning against the doorframe of Max's room, "I wanted to be an astronaut when I was your age." Max looked up, surprise momentarily overtaking his guarded expression. "You did?" Matthew nodded, a wistful smile playing on his lips. "Oh yeah, I used to spend hours staring up at the stars, dreaming about floating in zero gravity." "What happened?" Max asked, his curiosity getting the better of him. Matthew's smile turned rueful. "Life, I suppose. I got caught up in other things, forgot about those dreams. But you know what? It's never too late to look up at the stars again." That night, Matthew and Max lay on a blanket in the backyard, a telescope between them, rediscovering the constellations together. As Max excitedly pointed out the planets he could identify, Matthew felt a fierce surge of love and pride. He vowed then and there that he would never again let anything come between him and these moments with his children. But while Matthew was making strides in his personal life, the public's opinion of him remained decidedly negative. Late-night talk show hosts continued to use him as the punchline of their jokes, and social media was awash with memes mocking his fall from grace. It all came to a head one crisp autumn morning when Matthew decided it was time to face the music. He agreed to an interview with Diane Sawyer, one of the most respected journalists in the business. The interview was to be broadcast live, with no pre-approved questions or topics off-limits. As Matthew sat in the makeup chair preparing for the interview, he felt a familiar knot of anxiety in his stomach. But this time it was different. He wasn't anxious about protecting his image or his company's stock price. No, this time he was nervous because he was about to bare his soul to the world, to show them the real Matthew Turner, flaws and all. The lights of the studio were blinding as Matthew took his seat across from Diane. Her piercing gaze seemed to see right through him as she launched into her first question. "Mr. Turner, you've been at the center of what many are calling the scandal of the year. A billionaire CEO having an affair with his children's nanny. It reads like a cliché. What do you have to say for yourself?" Matthew took a deep breath. This was it. No more hiding, no more PR-approved statements. Just the truth. "You're right, Diane," he said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "It does sound like a cliché. And in many ways, that's exactly what I had become. A cliché of a powerful man who had lost touch with what really matters in life." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I'm not here to make excuses for my behavior. What I did was wrong, and I've hurt a lot of people. My children, Emma, my employees, even the public who trusted in the image I'd cultivated. But I am here to take responsibility for my actions and to talk about where I go from here." Diane leaned forward, clearly intrigued by his candor. "And where is that, Mr. Turner? Where do you go from here?" Matthew's eyes shone with a determination that had been missing for years. "I go back to the beginning, Diane. I go back to being a human being first and a businessman second. I've spent years building an empire, but in the process, I lost sight of what truly matters: family, love, genuine human connection." As the interview progressed, Matthew spoke with a raw honesty that caught viewers off guard. He talked about his failings as a father, his loneliness despite his wealth, and the wake-up call that the scandal had provided. He didn't shy away from the difficult questions. answering each with a vulnerability that was both surprising and compelling. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Matthew said towards the end of the interview, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm not even asking for understanding. What I'm asking for is a chance to do better, to be better. Not just for myself, but for my children, for Emma and our unborn child, and for all the people who have been affected by my actions." As the cameras stopped rolling, there was a moment of stunned silence in the studio. Diane reached out and squeezed Matthew's hand, a gesture of understanding that meant more to him than any business deal ever had. In the days that followed, the interview became the talk of the nation. Social media exploded with reactions, many expressing surprise at Matthew's honesty and vulnerability. While there were still plenty of critics, there was also a growing sentiment that perhaps Matthew Turner wasn't the heartless billionaire they'd all assumed him to be. Alone in his study that night, Matthew sat at his desk, staring at a framed photo of his children. He picked up his phone, hesitating for a moment before dialing Emma's number. "Hello?" Her voice came through, sounding tired but not unwelcoming. "Emma," Matthew said softly. I did the interview today." "I know," she replied. "I watched it." There was a pause, heavy with unspoken emotions. Then Emma continued, her voice gentle. "It was brave, what you did. Honest." Matthew felt a lump form in his throat. "I meant every word," he said, "especially the part about wanting to do better, to be better. For you, for the baby, for all of us." Another pause, shorter this time. "I believe you," Emma said finally. "We have a long way to go, Matthew, but I think we might just make it." As he hung up the phone, Matthew felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right path. Not the path to greater wealth or power, but the path to becoming the man he should have been all along. The transformation of Matthew Turner had begun in earnest, and the world was watching with bated breath to see where it would lead. The months following Matthew's groundbreaking interview were a whirlwind of change and self-discovery. As winter gave way to spring, so too did the old Matthew Turner give way to a new, more compassionate version of himself. The transformation wasn't easy. Old habits die hard, after all. But Matthew attacked this challenge with the same determination that had once made him a titan of industry. His first major decision came as a shock to many. Matthew announced that he would be stepping down as CEO of Turner Enterprises. In a press conference that left many business analysts scratching their heads, he explained his reasoning. "For too long, I've defined myself by my title and my net worth," Matthew said, standing tall behind a podium adorned with the Turner Enterprises logo. "But recent events have shown me that there's more to life than quarterly reports and stock prices. I'm not abandoning the company, far from it. But I believe it's time for new leadership, someone who can guide Turner Enterprises into the future while I focus on what truly matters, being a better father, a better man, and hopefully a force for positive change in the world." The announcement sent shockwaves through the business world. Turner Enterprises stock took an initial hit, but stabilized quickly as Matthew assured investors and employees alike that he would remain on the board of directors, providing guidance and support to the new CEO. With more time on his hands, Matthew threw himself into rebuilding his relationships with his children. He was there for Max's science fair, beaming with pride as his son explained his project on renewable energy to the judges. He attended every one of Sophie's dance recitals, sitting in the front row and cheering louder than any other parent. But perhaps the most significant change came in his relationship with Emma and their unborn child. As Emma's pregnancy progressed, Matthew was there every step of the way. He attended every doctor's appointment, helped set up the nursery, and even enrolled in birthing classes alongside Emma. It wasn't always smooth sailing. There were awkward moments, heated arguments, and times when both Matthew and Emma questioned whether they were doing the right thing. But through it all, they persevered, bound by their shared commitment to their child and the family they were building. As Emma's due date approached, Matthew found himself pondering his legacy. He had spent years building a business empire, but what would he leave behind that truly mattered? It was during one of his late-night pondering sessions that inspiration struck. The next morning, Matthew called an emergency meeting with his financial advisors and lawyers. They spent hours poring over documents, crunching numbers, and debating possibilities. When they emerged, bleary-eyed but excited, Matthew knew he had found his new purpose. A week later, he held another press conference. This time, however, the atmosphere was different. Gone was the power suit and the imposing backdrop of the Turner Enterprises logo. Instead, Matthew stood before the cameras in a simple button-down shirt and slacks, his expression open and earnest. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady and clear, "I stand before you today not as a CEO or a billionaire, but as a man who has been given a second chance at life. And with that second chance comes a responsibility to give back, to make a difference in the lives of those who haven't been as fortunate as I have." He paused, looking out at the sea of reporters and cameras. "That's why I'm announcing." Matthew took a deep breath before continuing, his eyes shining with purpose. "That's why I'm announcing the creation of the Turner Family Foundation. This foundation will be dedicated to helping single parents and their children, providing resources, education, and support to those who need it most." A murmur rippled through the crowd of reporters. This was unexpected, to say the least. "I'm committing $5 billion of my personal wealth to this foundation," Matthew continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "This isn't just about writing a check. I'll be personally involved in the foundation's work, using the skills and experience I've gained in business to make a real difference in people's lives." The press conference erupted into a frenzy of questions. Reporters clamored for more details, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of curiosity and skepticism. Matthew held up his hands, calling for quiet. "I know this might seem like a drastic move," he said, a small smile playing on his lips. "And maybe it is. But recent events have taught me that true wealth isn't measured in dollars and cents. It's measured in the lives we touch, the positive change we create in the world." As the news of Matthew's announcement spread, public opinion began to shift. Social media, once filled with memes mocking his fall from grace, now buzzed with discussions about his transformation. While there were still skeptics who viewed his actions as a PR stunt, many were moved by his apparent sincerity and the scale of his commitment. In the weeks that followed, Matthew threw himself into the work of setting up the foundation. He assembled a team of experts in social work, education, and community development, working alongside them to create programs that would have a real, tangible impact on the lives of single parents and their children. One sunny afternoon, as Matthew was poring over proposals for the foundation's first initiative, he received a call from Emma. Her voice was tight with tension. "Matthew," she said, I think it's time. The baby's coming." The next 24 hours were a blur of activity. Matthew rushed to the hospital, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and terror. He stayed by Emma's side throughout her labor, holding her hand, offering words of encouragement, and marveling at her strength. As the first rays of dawn broke through the hospital windows, a new cry joined the chorus of the world. Matthew's daughter was born, a tiny, perfect being with a shock of dark hair and eyes that seemed to hold all the wisdom of the universe. As he held his newborn daughter for the first time, Matthew felt a surge of love so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. Tears streamed down his face as he looked from the baby to Emma, exhausted but radiant in the hospital bed. "She's beautiful," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "Thank you, Emma, for everything." Emma smiled, reaching out to touch the baby's tiny hand. "What should we name her?" she asked softly. Matthew thought for a moment, then smiled. "How about Hope?" he suggested. "Because that's what she represents. Hope for a better future for all of us." Emma nodded, her eyes shining. "Hope," she repeated. "It's perfect." As news of Hope's birth spread, Matthew received an unexpected visitor at the hospital. His brother Daniel arrived, a tentative smile on his face and a stuffed bear tucked under his arm. "I heard I have a new niece," Daniel said, his voice gruff with emotion. "Thought I should come meet her." The brothers embraced, years of hurt and misunderstanding melting away in the face of new life and new beginnings. As Daniel held Hope for the first time, Matthew felt the last pieces of his new life falling into place. Chapter 7. A Life Transformed. 5 years passed in the blink of an eye. The world had watched with fascination as Matthew Turner, once the poster child for corporate greed, transformed into a beacon of philanthropy and social responsibility. The Turner Family Foundation had grown beyond anyone's wildest expectations. Its programs had helped thousands of single parents find stable employment, pursue education, and provide better lives for their children. Matthew was a constant presence at foundation events, rolling up his sleeves to work alongside volunteers, listening to the stories of those the foundation had helped, and continuously looking for ways to improve and expand their reach. On a warm summer evening, Matthew stood on the porch of his new home, a modest but comfortable house in a quiet neighborhood, worlds away from his former Hamptons mansion. The sound of laughter drifted from the backyard, where a birthday party was in full swing. Hope, now a vivacious 5-year-old with her father's determination and her mother's kindness, was celebrating her birthday surrounded by family and friends. Max and Sophie, now teenagers, were there too, having fully embraced their role as older siblings to Hope. Emma appeared at Matthew's side, slipping her hand into his. Their relationship had evolved over the years into a deep partnership based on mutual respect and shared purpose. While romance had never rekindled between them, they had found something perhaps more valuable: a true friendship and a shared commitment to raising their daughter. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Emma asked, nudging Matthew gently. Matthew smiled, squeezing her hand. "Just thinking about how far we've come," he said softly. 5 years ago, I couldn't have imagined any of this." Emma nodded, her gaze drifting to where Hope was gleefully opening presents, surrounded by her siblings and cousins. "You've done good, Matthew," she said. "Really good." As if on cue, Hope looked up, her face lighting up as she spotted her parents. "Daddy, Mommy, come see what Uncle Daniel got me." Matthew and Emma made their way to the cluster of children, where Hope proudly held up a telescope. Daniel, standing nearby with his wife and their young son, grinned at Matthew. "Thought it was time she started exploring the stars," Daniel said, winking at Max. "I hear it runs in the family." Max, now a lanky 15-year-old with dreams of studying astrophysics, blushed but looked pleased. Sophie, 14 and already showing signs of becoming a formidable young woman, was busy helping Hope set up the telescope. As Matthew watched his family, biological and chosen, interact, he felt a profound sense of peace wash over him. This, he realized, was true success. Not the numbers in a bank account or the size of a corporate empire, but the love and connection shared between people who cared for each other. Later that night, after the party had wound down and the children were asleep, Matthew sat in his study. The walls, once adorned with awards and financial charts, now held family photos and children's artwork. On his desk sat a framed article, the cover of Time magazine, with Matthew's face and the headline, "The Billionaire Who Gave It All Away, Matthew Turner's Redemption Story." He picked up the magazine, running his fingers over the glossy cover. The man in the photo looked different from the Matthew of old. There were lines around his eyes now, and his hair was streaked with gray. But there was also a warmth in his gaze, a genuine smile on his lips that had been absent for so long. A soft knock at the door pulled Matthew from his reverie. He looked up to see Max standing in the doorway, a serious expression on his young face. "Dad, can we talk?" "Of course, son," Matthew said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "What's on your mind?" Max sat down, fidgeting slightly before meeting his father's gaze. "I've been thinking a lot about the future," he began, "about college and what I want to do with my life." Matthew nodded encouragingly, remembering his own struggles at that age. "And what have you decided?" "I want to study astrophysics," Max said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I want to explore the stars, Dad, maybe even become an astronaut one day." Matthew felt his heart swell with pride and a touch of bittersweet nostalgia. "That's wonderful, Max," he said softly. "You know, when I was your age, I had the same dream." Max's eyes widened in surprise. "You did, but I thought you always wanted to be a businessman." Matthew shook his head, a rueful smile playing on his lips. No, that came later. When I was young, I wanted nothing more than to float among the stars. He paused, memories flooding back. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of that dream. I got caught up in making money, in building an empire. I forgot to look up at the stars. He leaned forward, placing a hand on Max's shoulder. Don't make the same mistake I did, son. Chase your dreams, no matter where they lead you. And always, always remember to look up at the stars. Max nodded, his eyes shining with a mixture of determination and gratitude. As he stood to leave, he hesitated for a moment before wrapping his arms around his father in a tight hug. Thanks, Dad, he whispered, for everything. As the door closed behind Max, Matthew turned back to the window, gazing out at the night sky. The stars twinkled back at him, as bright and mysterious as they had been when he was a boy with dreams of space exploration. He thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment, the rise to power, the fall from grace, and the long, difficult climb back to humanity. It hadn't been easy, and there had been moments when he'd questioned everything. But looking back now, he wouldn't change a thing. Matthew Turner, once known as the cold-hearted billionaire, had found something far more valuable than all the money in the world. He had found love, purpose, and a chance to make a real difference in the world. As he stood there, bathed in starlight, Matthew made a silent vow. He would continue to work, to strive, to push himself, not for personal gain or glory, but for the betterment of others. He would use his skills, his resources, and his second chance at life to leave the world a little better than he found it. And every night, no matter how busy or tired he might be, he would take a moment to look up at the stars and remember the dreams of his youth. For in those dreams lay the key to his redemption, the reminder that within every human heart, no matter how hardened by life or success, there still burns the flame of hope, wonder, and the capacity for change. As Matthew finally turned away from the window and prepared for bed, he felt a sense of contentment that no amount of wealth had ever brought him. He was no longer the billionaire CEO, the titan of industry, or the scandal-ridden public figure. He was simply Matthew, a father, a friend, a man doing his best to make amends and make a difference. And for the first time in his life, that was more than enough. The story of Matthew Turner, the billionaire who found his humanity, would be told for years to come. It would inspire others to look beyond the trappings of wealth and success, to seek the true riches of life, love, family, and the opportunity to make a positive impact on the world. And somewhere out there, among the countless stars in the night sky, perhaps there was a young dreamer looking up and wondering about the mysteries of the universe. Matthew hoped that, unlike him, that dreamer would never lose sight of the stars. For in those distant pinpricks of light lay the promise of all that was possible: redemption, transformation, and the endless potential of the human spirit.